Guys, one of the biggest stories on the planet is the alleged murder of a Saudi journalist, most recently working for an American newspaper, the Washington Post, and living in Virginia, who went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, and never came out. This is a really big story, not just because of the allegations around what would be a state-sponsored assassination, but it involves an American NATO ally, Turkey, and our Middle East ally, Saudi Arabia. And lurking in the background of all of this is Iran. If there's one person to talk to about Saudi Arabia and Turkey, it's Jonathan Schanzer, Vice President of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
What I'm hearing from folks who've seen some of the intel is that they are reasonably certain, in fact, almost entirely certain, that Saudi Arabia was responsible for the death of Jamal Khashoggi.
And if Saudi Arabia is responsible for this murder, what does that mean? What's at stake?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, number one, this took place on foreign soil, allegedly in a consulate. There's a lot, I think, of lessons to be learned about this if you are a rogue state. So if you're China or you're Russia or you're North Korea or even Turkey for that matter, and you're seeing that you can get away with this, then it is the exact wrong message for the United States to be sending. So I think there's a lot on the line here. On top of that, there is kind of the broader question of Saudi Arabia. As we all know, they have a very powerful crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who over the last year or two has really been touting this reform program, something called Vision 2030, where by 2030, Saudi Arabia was going to really decrease its dependence on oil, increase education in the kingdom. And we've seen elements of this reform start to kick in. Women are driving, they're opening up movie theaters, and overall the kind of repression that we've seen inside the kingdom has dissipated. So we've seen these sort of positive measures, and then this. And this is a real blow to the idea that Saudi Arabia is on the right path to reform if, in fact, Saudi Arabia is found guilty of this murder.
Why does that matter?
So look, there are a couple of key things that I think we need to watch right now. One is that Saudi Arabia has just promised to pump a ton of oil into the global oil economy because we're now imposing sanctions on Iran. New sanctions are coming into place in early November, and a key component of the Trump administration policy of isolating Iran economically is making sure that Saudi Arabia can cover that gap. So if we find ourselves at odds with the Saudis, you can imagine what kind of an impact this would be on one of Trump's signature foreign policy issues. So that's incredibly awkward.
Well, and let me just stop you there, because we talked a lot about that. So that would mean if that doesn't happen, then oil prices can go way up, and oil prices and gas prices can go way up. And we were just talking about on our site that the spike in oil prices has predated the last 5 recessions. So this is why oil is really, really important to any American citizen. And I don't mean to stop you there, Jonathan, but just wanted to make a finer point on that.
No, absolutely. It'll hit Americans in the pocketbook, but also, this overall effort to isolate Iran, which I think this could be really one of the last bites of the apple. We've gone through kind of various iterations of this, and Trump really does feel like, he's got a vision for what he wants to do in terms of pushing Iran to the brink to try to maybe change some of their behavior, cease their terrorist activities abroad, things like that. So there's the economic issues at home, there's the foreign policy and national security issues abroad. So it's huge. I can't stress this enough. Again, Saudi Arabia sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. They are the major player here, and it's hard to ignore that.
So what else is at stake then when it comes to our relationship with Turkey? Because Turkey's a NATO ally. Turkey has grown closer, arguably, to Iran, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey have tension. And here we've slapped these tariffs on Turkey recently because of the imprisonment of an American pastor that was just released this weekend. So what's at stake with us with Turkey as well?
So it's interesting. I mean, so Turkey right now, they're at the sort of at the center of this investigation. They're the ones who are pointing out the alleged evidence, and this is why people, by the way, are not entirely comfortable with the story they're getting out of Istanbul. It's because the Turks are really, they have a terrible track record of disinformation, really state-owned media outlets that just lie to the public, flat out lie. So when we see these sorts of reports come out, there's a lot of discomfort with this. Nevertheless, there is obviously there is concern, and there's an effort right now to work with the Turks. But at the same time, the Turks are the #1 jailers of journalists in the world. They have themselves conducted illegal renditions of what they consider to be their opposition, something called the Gulen Network, which they blame for the 2016 failed coup in that country. And on top of that, they have helped Iran evade sanctions. They have been supporting Hamas. They've been supporting Al-Qaeda. So, I mean, they're basically kind of a rogue state unto themselves, even though they're NATO allies, even though we have a long history of working with them. So, in a sense, this is sort of alien versus predator. There's really no good guy in all of this, but both relationships are incredibly important to the United States. And what we're sensing right now is that perhaps the U.S. is trying to orchestrate some kind of grand bargain where maybe the two countries agree. They've already said they've agreed to some kind of a joint investigation into the disappearance of this Saudi journalist, and that perhaps there's a way for the U.S. to offer them a ladder to climb down from what could otherwise be an escalating conflict that nobody really wants. If you have two allies fighting each other and the U.S. caught in the middle, you can imagine how difficult this would be for the Trump administration.
And what would be the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario would be the Turks continue to share information about Khashoggi, leaking it in the press, and basically undermining international support for the Saudis, which, by the way, may be warranted, but then thereby destabilizing the Saudis, pushing them further away from the United States. In the meantime, Turkey and Saudi Arabia perhaps start to go at it in terms of information warfare, and they become openly acrimonious to one another. You see oil prices begin to skyrocket. You see, a lack of coordination on Iran. I could just imagine a number of things happening here. Repression actually increases with both countries. Our alliance phrase with both countries. This is the nightmare scenario. I think right now you have an administration that is trying to hold everything together with duct tape, and it'll be very interesting to see whether it works.
So what would be the best case scenario then in your mind?
Well, here's the thing. I'm not sure there is a best case scenario any longer, right? I mean, we want the truth about Jamal Khashoggi. And if that means that the Saudis were responsible, they need to be held responsible for this. At the same time, I think there is an effort for the U.S. to try to get the Saudis and the Turks to minimize the conflict over Khashoggi and perhaps find a soft landing so that everybody can move on. The U.S. can continue to work with Saudi Arabia. They can get Turkey back in the sort of alliance that we're comfortable with. This is kind of, I think, the best case scenario for the United States. But that does not address the real concerns that we have about Khashoggi. And my fear is that we end up going in this direction. It's the best thing for kind of U.S. policy moving forward, but we don't address a real crime that was committed in Istanbul last week. So again, I think the real issue for the United States is to figure out how to settle all of this at once. Hold Saudi Arabia accountable, hold Turkey accountable, keep our Iran policy in place. This is a high wire act for the Trump administration. I do not envy the people who are advising the president right now in the Middle East. This is an incredibly challenging moment.
It sounds like you're saying it's one of the most challenging moments of the administration so far.
I think so, and I think that it's not. I don't think it's widely understood enough what is on the line here. I think when we think about this administration, you think about the battle over Kavanaugh or the battle every day between the president and the press. This, to me, seems like the president's first real big test on the international stage. The North Korea thing still playing out. The Iran sanctions issue was kind of a no-brainer for him. This one is really going to require some tap dancing, and we'll see how the administration handles this challenge. It's a tough one.
And you're saying really the stakes for the American people are national security and our economy?
I think absolutely both, as well as kind of a long-term trajectory of our alliances in the Middle East, which will have an impact on oil. It'll have an impact potentially on NATO. There's a lot at stake here. I don't want to overplay, what could happen to the United States if this goes badly, but I would say there are a lot of people who are very concerned.
Indeed. Jonathan, thank you so much.
My pleasure.